Welcome, everyone. Once again, we have a very esteemed speaker with us, Elliot Cohen, a principal founder of the Philosophical Counseling in the United States, an executive director and co-founder of the National Philosophical Counseling Association, creator of Logic-Based Therapy, and the president of the Logic-Based Therapy and Consultation Institute. He is also the editor-in-chief and founder of the International Journal of Applied Philosophy and the International Journal of Philosophical Practice. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us. An author of 30 books. I think we need some inspiration from you from there. Making Peace with Imperfection is his latest cognitive behavioral interventions for self-defeating beliefs. So as I mentioned to you, I'm also trained from the cognitive behavioral background, doing a lot of cognitive behavioral techniques with our clients here, also doing REBT. Can you take the platform on and give us some more information about yourself?
Well, I'm trained as a philosopher from Brown University. My original training was in analytic philosophy, and I always had a desire to see what it could do in the real world. And through various phases in my life, I became interested in using logic and critical thinking to help solve problems in ordinary life. And I was working on a book called Making Value Judgments on a grant from the University of Florida when my wife read the book and my manuscript and said she had been taking courses towards being a mental health counselor, and she told me, Albert Ellis, I'm studying this guy named Albert Ellis, and he sounds a lot like what you're doing. Yep. So I contacted Albert and asked if I could have the training, and went for his training and got to know him very well. And he was a good friend and mentor of mine for many years, and he helped me develop my form of rational motive behavior therapy, which is a highly philosophical version of REBT. It derives from it, but it adds logic and philosophy and virtue theory to it.
Right. And so coming from a very philosophical culture, what I see is, after my training from the US, we in India believe a lot in how to live life, how to sort problems of life from a very philosophical context. And I think my main purpose has been to, again, integrate REBT into our culture. Can we just start about, talking about your book about making peace with imperfection? Because I think in COVID, we all have realized that, the entire, the type A personality, the perfectionism didn't work at all, from work from home, from scenarios. We saw a lot of people having breakdowns, depression, anxiety.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's really two types of perfectionism. Some people wear perfectionism as a badge of honor. They say, I'm a perfectionist. And we can understand it in different ways. One is a good way, and the other is a not so good way. In fact, a pretty self-destructive way. The good way is, well, I strive for perfection, but I can shoot for the stars, but I don't put myself through hell if I don't land on them. Right. I don't demand, that I be perfect. I just shoot for the best I can possibly be. And so I call that an aspirational perfectionist. And I think that's fine, as a philosophy of life. On the other hand, there are the perfectionists that not only say that they're going to be perfect, but they demand it. And I call that demanding perfectionism. And it's this I have to be perfect. I must be perfect. And if I'm not, then I'm no good.
Yeah.
And that is the form of perfectionism, that really can be very self-destructive. It can create a lot of anxiety. It can create depression. And we mentioned obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, that can, also be a result of it. And, we can talk about these things.
Yeah. So just starting from the definition of the word perfectionism, right? So for our viewers, I want you all to be on the same page as us. What are we defining perfectionism in today's society?
And I think, the society has the idea of perfection. I mean, in ordinary language, we say that's perfect.
Yeah.
And we don't really mean anything by it. What time would you like to meet? 10 a.m. Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah.
That's benign. That use that's very common. Is that's a good time for me. That's okay. But in the clinical sense of perfection, where one says that things literally have to be perfect, where you're not talking metaphorically, you're not talking, in terms of just trying to be polite, in ordinary parlance, but you really take seriously, this idea of perfection, and you demand it of yourself. That's the problem.
So when you're looking at perfectionism, we're talking about day-to-day perfectionism at work, with yourself, in your relationships. So are we talking about perfectionism in all aspects?
Well, different. You mentioned culture. Now, I mean, we might have different ideas about what's perfect, in different cultures, and so culturation can, influence what you think is perfect.
Okay.
But the problem, the clinical problem, the problem of living, I should say, is that you demand perfection, whatever that construct is. And so I've done work in India, and I've done work in Taiwan and other places in Europe, and there's different ideas about what might be perfect, but the problem of perfectionism still exists, because once you define what your set of attributes are that are define what's perfect, do you have to achieve it, you see? And again, it's the must that creates the problem.
Yeah, and tying it up with OCD, and specifically through the pandemic, we've seen a lot of emphasis on hygiene. So how would you sort of correlate perfectionism to an obsessive compulsive disorder?
Yeah, there's at least two senses of obsession, and one is what I call existential obsession. And existential obsession is the demand for certainty,
Yeah.
that bad things don't happen. And so, if you demand, hygiene to the point that you're sure that you're not going to get COVID,
Yeah.
then you see you're doing this kind of existential. You're going to end up with existential obsessions. I must be sure that I'm not going to get COVID. My hygiene is perfect, and if I'm not, and I'm really not, because there's a part of your brain that's realistic, and it reminds you that you're really not sure. There's a possibility that maybe you missed a germ.
Yeah. Or you inhale, for that matter.
Or you inhaled. Yeah, that's right. So you're realizing you can't be perfect, but yet you're demanding, that your hygiene be perfect. And so there's this contradiction in your premises that's going on. And it's that contradiction that creates this discomfort, this uneasiness. And it's reflected in language such as, oh, how horrible, how awful, how terrible. And that language itself has the ability to actually increase the way you feel inside, that nervousness and that nervous tension. And so that leads you to say, well, oh, this is so hard. I have to be sure.
Yeah.
So it ends up in this vicious circularity. I must be sure, but I'm not. How horrible. So I have to make sure. And then you go around and around and around, and that's the rumination. That's the ruminative cycle.
And I think as the pandemic has progressed, in India in the last 18 months, we haven't started schools for kids in some states. So it's been very tough on kids as well as adults. And we, even now with the new variant, we are seeing a lot of people panicking, obsessively washing hands, washing objects, not leaving their house at all, to the extent where they are getting extremely depressed and lonely.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And one of the things that I teach is that extremes are, unsatisfactory. They lead to anxiety and depression and so forth. And it doesn't matter what extreme. I mean, if you demand, that you be sure, you can get into trouble. Or if you don't care about anything, you don't take any precautions whatsoever. See, and the idea here is, as old ancient philosopher Aristotle would say, the mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. That's a good idea.
Yeah. So in common language, then what is the self-talk that one can have to get to the middle ground? Like you said, we don't want to be two extremes on either side.
Yeah, well, in terms of self-criticism, for instance, and perfectionism, there's different types of perfectionism, that we should be aware of that actually lead to self-criticism. And let me go over some of the types of perfectionism that there actually are, and I think that'll clear up some of this.
Yes.
There's self-regarding perfectionism, and that's the type of perfectionism that leads to self-criticism, and that's where we can talk about attaining that mean with respect to self-regulation. And the types of perfectionism involved there are achievement perfectionism. I must achieve. I must be successful at whatever I do.
Yes.
Approval perfectionism.
Yep.
I must have the approval of others. Moral perfectionism. I must not do anything wrong.
Yes.
And control perfectionism. I must always be in control. So these are demands that one makes upon oneself. Okay. And then there's other regarding perfectionism, where you make demands of others. Others must meet my expectations. Others must approve of me. See, and this is different than approval perfectionism, because essentially you're demanding that others do something in this case.
Yeah.
In the other case, you're demanding that you get their approval. Here it's, they must approve of me. And if they don't, they're no good.
Yeah.
See,
and among the four perfectionists that you mentioned, so we are seeing a single person can have more than one, right?
Yes,
yep.
Yes, exactly. And they often do. And then there's other regarding perfectionism is treatment perfectionism. Others must always treat me right. They must always be fair, and if not, they're horrible, or it's horrible. You can either catastrophize or damn others. And so they're common syndromes of fallacies, as I call it, that people get themselves into. Then there's world regarding perfectionism. And one is existential perfectionism, as we were talking about. Everything, must, bad things must never happen, in the world. Neatness perfectionism, the world must be neat and tidy. And actually, there's quite a number of people who are neatness perfectionists, and they drive themselves crazy, about that. Certainty perfectionism, we were talking about that with respect to OCD. That is, I must be certain. Okay. And getting this Aristotelian mean, as we were talking, involves being able to navigate these waters, to be able to realize what kind of perfectionism, that I'm dealing with, seeing my reasoning and looking at the rationality of these premises. How can I be perfect?
And so,
the world isn't.
And sorry, the difference between the certainty perfectionism and the control perfectionism would be the same, or would there be a difference between the two?
Well, they're much related, because some say I must be certain I have control,
Yes.
and then others say I must always be in control.
Yeah.
But they are related for certain, for certain.
So how does this relate to self-criticism? Because I think, with the whole perfectionist attitude, one can be very hard on themselves. And that's exactly what we see with obsessive compulsive disorders as well.
Yeah, people can be hard on themselves, because when you demand perfection and you fall short, then you can go after your own jugular and say, well, you're no good, it's your fault. And that's with regard to the self-regarding, forms of perfectionism. I must always be in control, must never fail at anything. I have to never do anything morally wrong. And if I do, I'm a horrible person, or I'm bad, I'm unworthy. I didn't get the approval of others, so there must be something really seriously wrong with me. So it's ultimately the perfectionism that leads to the self-criticism. So one deduces, in the parlance of what I call logic-based therapy, one deduces self-damnation from the demand for perfection. And that's the connection between self-criticism and perfectionism.
So when you're talking about self-criticism, is it evaluating yourself negatively, looking at yourself on the basis of other standards, or, because a lot of people say that, perfectionism is required at work. We have to get our numbers right. We have to get our modules right. The presentations, the sales have to be correct, and society by large is demanding that. So how does one cope with it in day-to-day life?
Well, if you tell yourself that you must never make a mistake, and say in a work context, is that really realistic? Do we know anybody who's never made a mistake?
No, not at all. Yeah.
No. And so, managers, at a managerial level, managers who realize, that, we want productivity, can also be open to the possibility that when you drive people and you demand perfection of them, you're going to create greater anxiety.
Yes.
And the anxiety actually is self-defeating, because once you're so anxious, you're not going to perform at your best.
Right.
So from the perspective of the employee, well, I'm going to, do what I can to get these things right. I have professionalism and I have high standards, but I'm not going to beat myself up and torment and torture myself, because that's what's going to create the anxiety. Anxiety is future oriented. Yeah. And so if I tell myself, I have to be perfect, what happens? Well, I did a good job now. But what happens if I screw up, down the road? Oh, how horrible, and then I start to catastrophize about it. Right. So if I demand perfection of myself in the workplace, in the demandingness sense here, not the aspirational sense that I mentioned before, right? Then it's self-defeating.
And so for many people that I see, I feel sometimes, and especially, the higher leadership in companies, they sort of look at perfectionism as an attitude to success.
Yeah, well, in terms of, I have to be perfect in order to be successful.
Yes.
Yeah, of course, that's the achievement perfectionist, and one thing that I hold to is that perfectionism is is kind of like an addiction. Okay, those who are perfectionists are addicted to it. They suffer from it, and they feel discomfort, regularly, and it's always hanging over their heads, like they have to have it, and essentially, if you're a perfectionist, one thing that you should not say to yourself, and that's that I'm cured. I'm no longer a perfectionist. I beat it, because you're always in recovery. You're always prone to it.
Right.
Say, and I could tell you that as a recovering perfectionist myself.
Okay, that's nice.
Okay. Yes, I am a perfectionist. Like I am an alcoholic. I am a perfectionist. I have demanded perfection and of myself, and in certain times of my life, I have been more prone towards perfectionism than others. But I have worked on it, and I have worked on letting go this demand, for perfection, and accepted the fact, that the world is imperfect, and so forth. But I have to be reminded of.
And so how does one make peace with imperfection? Because a lot of people, like you said, it's very discomforting to them. It's a space that they don't want to enter. They have to plan. So how does one make peace with letting go of just exactly how you shared your story with us?
Yeah, letting go of the demand for perfection. This letting go concept is really a very important construct. And in logic-based therapy, the form of therapy that grows out of rational motor behavior therapy that I've created, distinguishes different types of what it calls guiding virtues.
Right.
And the guiding virtue of perfection, the perfectionism, is what I call metaphysical security. Security about reality itself. It's the most generic form of virtue that you can have. And it goes to the heart of demanding perfection. One here accepts the idea that the world is imperfect. And there's different types of perfectionism. I must be perfect. Well, there's different types of security. I'm a human being. I'm fallible. I can mess up. So therefore, I am, an imperfect being. The world isn't perfectly in control. We can't control everything in the world. So I can give up this idea. It's irrational, that I must always be in control. Now, one of the, I think, the important features of logic-based therapy is that for these various guiding virtues, and another one for self-criticism, is self-respect, unconditional self-acceptance, which is what in the language of REBT is known as. But with respect to these virtues in logic-based therapy, there are certain types of philosophies that we can use to interpret those virtues, to support those virtues. Because look, if I might be looking for metaphysical security in my life, but if I'm a religious person, I might be looking for metaphysical security in one way, quite different than, say, an atheist. You see, so there's different philosophies, different worldviews that one can embrace to support the guiding virtues. So in logic-based therapy, we look for philosophies that we can use to support our guiding virtues, and then we apply those philosophies in our lives, in the quest for becoming more secure, more self-respecting, more temperate and more courageous and so forth with the various guiding virtues.
So can you sort of give us an example, from the guiding virtues of, how do we pave the path towards self-acceptance? Because we now, in the midst of COVID, and it's extremely hard and more harder for people who've been, perfectionists, like I said. So how do they move towards accepting imperfection?
And that leads me to say some things, give you some examples of different philosophies, for instance, that we could use to help us to feel more secure about reality, even though it's imperfect.
Right.
One good example here is Buddhism.
Yeah.
Buddhism teaches that reality is transitory, impermanent. So trying to hold on to it in a state of changelessness and perfection isn't going to work. So, embracing this philosophy here that the world is in a state of change, and change is the reality. It isn't permanence. There aren't these fixed perfections, that you can hang on to. And as soon as you try to do that, that's when you're going, trying to cling to these things when they're not going to stay where you want them to be. then that's where you're going to have problems.
A lot of the work of your philosophy do you take inputs from, like you said, the Eastern cultures, which you give an example about Buddhism. So are there any other philosophies that we can tie? Can you describe?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a number of them, but I'll just give you many of them, numerous ones, as much as the history of philosophy can provide. But Stoicism is a very popular form of philosophy. It basically teaches you to let go of trying to control the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others, since they're not in your control. So, if you're a control perfectionist, or you're an approval, perfectionist, and trying to get the approval of others, stop trying to control things that are outside of your control. Stick to the things that are in your control, like your own thoughts and your feelings and your own actions. There's existentialism, for instance. You have the freedom to define yourself through your own actions. And life changes always involve probabilities, not certainties. Whenever you act, Jean-Paul Sartre says, you're acting, and with probabilities. As soon as you give up probabilities, you're out of this world. Right. That's not part of the human condition. Say Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, be the creator of your own values, not the slave to others. Say, so if you're an approval perfectionist, you're a slave, to others. Yep. But if you're the creator of your own values, then you're not. Now, so when you embrace these various philosophies, that can help you to be more self-assured, less self-damning, more accepting, of the imperfections in reality and so forth. So this is, what logic-based therapy teaches. Now, it's very important. Let me emphasize that a key point of this approach is to fit individuals with the philosophies that work for them. Right. I'm not going to teach you a philosophy that I like, right? Because you may not like it, right? And then it won't work.
So like you said, so when you have to, the philosophy may not work, and some people may have strong beliefs or strong philosophical backgrounds that they believe in. How does one embrace a new philosophy, or how does one, sort of open their minds to learning something new, to give up this whole idea of perfectionism?
Well, it's to key into some of the intellectual lights that people have, but they have inconsistent. They hold these beliefs on one hand, but on the other, when they live their life, they demand perfection, and they don't realize the connections between these philosophies and what they prescribe. Right. So logic-based therapy asks two questions here. what is the philosophy that, you embrace? What does it, and it's got to feel good, literally feel good. It's got to create endorphins,
Yeah.
rushes. and once you embrace that philosophy, what does it what do you do now? What are the sorts of actions that you do now that are inconsistent with that philosophy? And therefore, what do you need to change? See, and that leads to the application. And as all cognitive behavioral approaches emphasize, it's not just the changing your thinking, but it's also changing your actions.
Yep.
So, getting a more coherent understanding, what's causing your anxiety, depression, and so forth. What are the premises that you're holding? Demanding perfection, deducing self-damnation, or catastrophizing from the perfectionism. And then realizing, the antidotes, the guiding virtues and the philosophical beliefs that can help change that. And we're here talking literally about changes in your brain.
Yep.
Because when you're going ruminating, or you're going through the perfectionist cycles, there's certain activity going on in your brain that are setting off very painful parts of your brain. For instance, the insular cortex is a part of your brain that feels pain, and it literally feels pain when you're going through these processes. But you could practice, for instance, imagery.
Yep.
Let yourself feel this pain, realizing where it's coming from, this perfectionism, and then embrace your philosophy and think about it. You can actually, and I've done this clinically with individuals. Here you are feeling this pain. Now change your thinking. Think about your Buddhism, think about Stoicism, think about Nietzsche or existentialism, Sartre, whatever turns you on. And then how do you feel? Well, typically when I do that with clients, what they tell me is they feel an immense sense of freedom, yep, relief. Say, and you could actually practice this, and let yourself feel better, and then go out and reinforce it through your actions.
Right. And so when you're talking about the philosophical counseling, often enough, when clients come into therapy and they've had no prior experience with therapy, they, sort of confused as to what counseling is. Is it just advice giving? So, I often tell them that, it's a philosophical way of life, of connecting to what you believe and then embracing it from there. So like you said, putting the philosophical background along with your CBT techniques, will get clients, sort of move on from their stuck situation.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and people think oftentimes that, the counseling is, tell me what to do.
Yes.
But it's not, that's not the way it works. What logic-based therapy does is provide a framework, but the flesh that you hang on it, is up to you. The types of philosophical ideas, the type of work, activities, behavioral exercises that you do, and imagery that you practice, and so forth, is all, stuff that you have to decide. So we can provide guidance in terms of a framework, but the rest is up to the client, to actually practice.
And so what would be some of the fundamental principles of the philosophical counseling then?
One principle that I mentioned that's extremely important is you don't force feed philosophy. Yeah. You let individuals find their own philosophies so that they can feel comfortable with those philosophies. Because again, this is a brain thing. It has to resonate with you. Right. It has to feel right. Otherwise, it isn't going to work.
Yep.
And so I've known philosophical counselors that they had a philosophy that they like, they embrace, they resonate with it, and they tried to get their clients to be mini me's of them. Yes. And it doesn't work, because I mean, imagine trying to force feed Nietzsche on a very fundamentalist Christian person, for instance.
Right.
It may not be too successful.
Right. And so, what if some of the youth, who come in specifically with this perfectionist attitude as to, in this competitive world, at 25, I want to be here, at 30, I'm going to ace it, so they have very strict rules and regulations as to where they want to be in life. What if they don't have a philosophical understanding of life? How, like you said, you can't force feed it. So, what would your stance be then?
Well, it isn't formal philosophy, that matters. You may not be able to put a name on your ideas,
Right.
or a specific philosopher or whatever, but ideas, can be efficacious if they're yours and they meet certain criteria. You see, in logic-based therapy, there's certain what I call cardinal fallacies, and perfectionism is one of them.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
there's catastrophizing, there's self-damnation,
Yeah.
and can't, what I call constipation.
Yeah.
I can't, you know, and a number of others. There's about 11 different categories of these. Some of them are empirical philosophies, reality distortions like probability distortions and false hypothesizing, bifurcation, and so forth. But the thing is, if you embrace a philosophy that satisfies these standards, that in other words, they don't commit these fallacies, and if the philosophy it is actually uplifting, that is, it helps to support a guiding virtue that you have, then it's okay. It doesn't matter what it is. And so individuals are free, to think about, what really they uphold within these very broad parameters. And once we get those philosophies, and it's I like to look at this almost like getting a vision test. When you put the
Glass. Yeah.
optometrist puts the lenses on and they say, can you see well through this one? No. Well, how about one or two? Oh,
Right.
one. How
Right.
about this? Two. And then finally, by a process, fine tuning, we get the philosophy. I've had clients who, we've talked about one philosophy and they seem to be, I help, to guide them, giving some fruit to it, through, for professional philosophers who, in the history of philosophy, but they don't have to know these philosophers. But sometimes they try it out and I do some imagery with them. It doesn't work. It doesn't really resonate with them. So let's go back. Let's talk more. And finally, typically, we find a philosophy. Even I've done this with undergraduate students as
Right.
well. And most of them don't know much about philosophy,
Yes.
whom I've worked with, and they find their philosophies. When they know it resonates with them, they'll tell you it lights up, and then they can use those philosophies to make constructive changes in their life.
And so about, just going back to a little bit of self-criticism and the whole self-judgment, can you give us, some practical day-to-day techniques, that, the viewers can apply? Because, you have a lot of self-doubt, a lot of shaming, a lot of embarrassment, while you are, going through your failures and obstacles of life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of shame, if you're a approval perfectionist, then shame attacking exercises are
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Albert Ellis was famous for making recommendations of those. He once talked about, taking a banana on a string and walking through a busy street pulling it. Oh, what's the point of that? Well, it shows you that you don't need the approval of others. You can do these things and not have the approval of others. So what happened? Was it catastrophic? No. You just walked through the street and a bunch of people who you could care less about and could care less about you thought you were crazy.
Yeah.
And did it matter? No. And so shame attacking exercises, typically things that are relatively harmless and legal, not immoral.
Right. Right.
You could practice those. If you're a certainty perfectionist, then practice taking some risks. I mean, say you're a certainty perfectionist and you don't like gambling at all, and you will not gamble a bloody cent. Go to the slot machines and put in your pennies and walk away. I mean, you've practiced, taking risks,
Right.
and you can take them, and then work up towards taking reasonable risks.
Right.
Control relinquishing. Let others make decisions for themselves instead of trying to control them. So you actually make a concerted effort. Well, here's where I usually step in and try to control this person. Let me just let them decide for themselves.
Right.
And so I can practice that.
And many parents, I think, will relate to that because they want their children to be as perfect as them. Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they defeat, by not allowing them to cultivate their autonomy, they, right. Defeat their own purposes, because then their children aren't, able, to make their own decisions. A neatness perfectionist, practice leaving some things out of order.
Right.
Practice not cleaning something up. I had a client who was about ready to break up with his girlfriend because she would come home and she'd go shopping and she'd put the things that she bought on the couch and leave them there. And he would have this demand that he go and pick them up and put them away for her. Yes. And he'd get very frustrated and angry. So his assignment was to leave them, not to pick them up.
Yeah.
and also
in terms of neatness perfectionism, so your obsessive cleaning would be sort of a neatness perfectionism.
Yes, exactly.
And so, a lot of clients do also say that the discomfort is very high, if we are challenging our thoughts, and they don't get that sense of relief. So, what would, how much time would this take?
Well, it takes time of habituation. In other words, if you have an old habit, then you're inclined, towards that particular type of behavior.
Right.
So it takes a while, in order for you to, reverse that. So yep. it takes, so you have to continuously practice. If you give up, then, and there's backsliding, you can fall back, but then you realize it and then you practice. And it takes a lifetime. You see, virtues, the kind of virtues we're talking about, whether it's courage or security or a self-respect, those are habits. You see, virtues are habits here. And you've got to work at it, in order to cultivate those habits over time. Doesn't happen, in a day. Another speaking of things that are very useful, or meditation, and there's different types of meditation. Mindfulness. If you're a loving kindness meditation is a type of meditation that could work really well if you're ego-centered or expectation perfectionist.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah. So by, like you said, it's very easy to go back into the relapse of your old pattern. And mm-hmm. how, like you said, you need to consistently sort of get into the philosophical space, believe in it, to actually see the change, and sometimes clients find it very difficult to adapt to change.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think one of the things that if from the therapist perspective is to be patient with clients. I had a client once who had this approval perfectionism, and he was actually a psychiatric nurse.
Right.
And he would go to his work and he would, demand that, he do, things perfectly to satisfy his boss, ultimately to get approval. And he talked to me about how he liked ties that had scenery on them, like
Right.
tropical islands, like palm trees and things. So I asked him to go out and purchase one of those ties and wear it to work. So it took him a while, several weeks, to actually purchase one. And then each time I'd ask him, "Did you wear it to work?" And he said, "No, I didn't." But I kept asking him. I didn't say, "That's it. I had it with you. I'm not going to work with you because you had to wear that tie to work." I just kept, asking him. And finally, he wore the tie to work. And I said, "Well, how'd it go?" He goes, "Oh, my boss loved it.
Right.
Everybody liked it." and so he finally accomplished, his goal, but it takes patience, and patience is a very important virtue. Even in LBT,
Yep.
it's one of the virtues that one has to work on oneself. So, and therapists need to exemplify the kinds of virtues, that they espouse. Otherwise, they're hypocrites and they come across as such, and it
Right.
doesn't,
And
reinforce.
my last question to you, sir, is, you spoke about courage and getting security. And how does one work on that? How does one work towards building that?
Building courage and security, again, takes perseverance. It takes time. It takes working both cognitively, philosophically here, on your thinking, doing imagery, and looking at keeping your fallacious thinking in mind. These are I demand perfection. I self-damn. These are the things that I do. Go through what we call a refutation process, where, well, if I have to be, and to be perfect, I have to, if to be a good, I have to always be perfect. What does that imply for everybody? Is there anybody who satisfies that standard? No. So what am I demanding it of myself if I don't demand it of others? I'm inconsistent. See that we can engage in this kind of reflective thinking, where we constantly work on, our irrational thinking, and then work on applying, our keeping our guiding virtues in our forefront, and working on the philosophical ideas that promote those guiding virtues, applying them behaviorally, continuing to ask ourselves, what is it I'm doing now? And, is this what my philosophy would tell me to do? And, and push oneself, literally overcome that inertia that one has by pushing oneself, to act, according to the philosophical lights that you resonate.
Right.
And yeah.
So I think that's very insightful, because I think we come from a culture, at least I come from a culture, where we believe a lot in philosophy, and we have a lot of spiritual leaders out there. But having said that, like you said, it has to be practically applied and tied into what can work, and how the application works for you. So thank you so much. It was extremely helpful for us. Any last words, sir? Through COVID, what is the right attitude or the right approach that can help us all, flow through this period of uncertainty?
I might add that we have a center,
Yep.
in India, in Mumbai, and one of the things we're working on is Indian philosophy,
Yep.
because it has so much imagery,
Yes.
uplifting imagery, that can be very useful for helping to make permanent brain changes, towards a positive direction. So that's a very important resource, that India has, its philosophies.
Right. Thank you so much. And so we will be putting down your books and your contact details on our page so our viewers can contact you or your center in India, like you said. Thank you so much once again, and it was extremely, extremely helpful.
My pleasure.
Thank you.